Cheers. My name is Victor Ryan, for those who don't know. Been at SSP for 15 years now. Today I'm Taylor Fravel, 10 years younger and a lot less hair. Taylor is away in the Turks and Caicos, and I'm deathly afraid he won't come back. So today we are delighted to host Alexandra Bell, who is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. She's a noted policy expert, former diplomat. She oversees the Bulletin's publishing programs, management of the Doomsday Clock, which was just set at 85. What is it? 85. 85, not 80. 85 seconds to midnight, and a growing set of activities around nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. Before joining the Bulletin, Alex served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Nuclear Affairs in the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability at the State Department, where she managed the offices of Strategic Stability and Deterrence and Multilateral Nuclear Affairs, and was counterpart for me at the State Department when I was in the Department of Defense. And I think Matthew worked for her. So a lot of ties, familiarity to Alex. And from 2017 to 2021, she was the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation and the Council for a Livable World. Previously, she served as a senior advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security and as an advisor in ADS, then named the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. Before joining the State Department in 2010, she worked on nuclear policy issues at Plowshares in the Center for American Progress. She's a noted expert appearing in all the media you expect, for the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a regular commentator on TV too, I see. That's bold. They don't let me go.
Actually, in my bio?
They don't let me go on live TV. She received a master's degree in international affairs from the New School and a bachelor's degree in peace, war, and defense from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hills. And prior to that, I think most interesting and cool, she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica, and she's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's going to speak today on the third nuclear age. Will our luck finally run out? It's a pleasure and delight to welcome a good friend, Alex Bell, and she'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A, and I'll keep traffic. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks so much. I need to get a shorter bio. I'm so glad to be here today. I'm grateful to see people interested in where we're going with nuclear policy. We need a new generation of thinkers. We also need new thinking on these issues. I have some, I'll admit, as a State Department person, slides are not my thing. So these slides will just be a framer, but like really kind of, going through the major issues I think we need to discuss here in the 80th year. I was at a roundtable discussion about 15 years ago in DC, and a person in the room paraphrased some thinking from the much heralded book by Mort Halperin and Thomas Schelling, Strategy in Arms Control. Just so happened that Mort Halperin was in the room at the time, and he quipped that he was glad that the person read that book, but it was 50 years old and people should be coming up with new ideas. Everyone laughed, but something occurred to me then, and it stayed with me. It's that we need to be informed by the past, but not shackled to it. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. If you've read my piece in the Bulletin's 80th anniversary edition, I apologize. A lot of this will seem familiar, but it does bear repeating. As you all know, we're now 80 years in to the nuclear age, and there has been no shortage of treatises on what this anniversary means. Other experts and I have followed the general anniversary format for years. We review the history of nuclear buildups and drawdowns. We marvel at some of the ludicrous suppositions that were made about nuclear weapons. We recount the near fatal escapes from nuclear crises and miscalculations. And then we carefully arrange earnest calls to action to reduce nuclear threats, or at times say everything is fine, likely while drinking coffee in front of a burning room. I will admit that something about this anniversary does feel different. 8 decades since the Trinity test and the first use and only use of atomic weapons in war, we now find ourselves at an inflection point. The rising tide of nuclear challenges threatens to break what remains of poorly tended metaphorical levees. We aren't just sleepwalking into a possible disaster. One could make the case we're just sort of ambling towards it. So we need a plan. Since becoming the president and CEO of the Bulletin, and because I am a nerd, I've spent a lot of time combing through our archives. On page 1 of the first issue of the Bulletin, the newly formed atomic scientists of Chicago implored the public to see the danger at hand. They warned that gains in wealth, economic security, or improved health would be useless if our nation is to live in continuous dread of sudden annihilation. That's the thing. We did figure out a way to prosper under the ever-present shadow of nuclear war. And while the threat of sudden annihilation does remain, the continuous dread is now largely relegated to the few of us who spend our lives thinking about the potential end of the world. It would be hard to explain to Einstein, Oppenheimer, or virtually anyone alive in 1945 that the fearsome reality of a world awash in nuclear weapons would in the future often be nothing more than background noise. They would likely be stunned to know that the world has been lulled into nuclear apathy by its own success in avoiding annihilation, without much thought to the possibility of what created that luck. And sometimes it could be very clearly sheer dumb luck. So the question is now, will our luck finally run out? I will concede that the truism that luck always runs out does not resonate with everyone working on managing nuclear threats. Over the course of my career, I've heard some statements about nuclear threats that made my jaw drop. I recall an expert lamenting that people think nukes are worse than they are, as if they weren't the most comprehensive killing machine ever created. I think about a former congressional staffer warily quipping, "It's a fantasy and a waste of time to think that we can make progress on arms control," as if we actually had the luxury to stop trying. I remember a colleague explaining that we don't want to seem desperate or plaintive about arms control, as if an arms race didn't come with its own foul scent of desperation. Of course, these statements have counterpoints at the other end of the ideological spectrum that are just as troubling. I marveled when an academic recently said that US allies have, quote, nothing to fear from China, as if Beijing's rapid and opaque nuclear buildup was just some benign undertaking. A disarmament advocate dismissed my concerns about effective verification of global zero, saying the International Atomic Energy Agency will figure it out, as if the IAEA had the necessary resources or the legal mandate to determine with certainty whether all countries had rid themselves of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. In defense of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I heard a proponent say they never expected a nuclear weapon state to join, which made me want to scream, "What are you doing all this for then?" So here we collectively find ourselves in the 80th year of the nuclear age, where every nuclear challenge is trending in the wrong direction, and a discourse that is caustic at best and at worst separated from reality. So in the interest of figuring out where we go from here, it's important to think about how we got here. Endless navel-gazing, cherry-picked historical anecdotes, and finger-pointing has long plagued the nuclear weapons debate. But at this juncture, a little reflection on how we got here is not only helpful, I would say it's necessary. Following the first nuclear test at Trinity, Manhattan Project scientists, including those who founded the Bulletin, began to raise alarms about the dangers of nuclear weapons and their proliferation. Those alarms went unheeded, and as you know, by 1949, the Soviets acquired their own nuclear capability, followed by the Brits, the Chinese, and the French. And the world braced for a reality of dozens of nuclear armed states. Common sense, likely aided by crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, eventually prevailed, and starting in 1970, through accession to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, most countries in the world agreed that we should seek another path. While the nuanced interpretations of what the NPT does and does not obligate countries to do could fill the streets of Cambridge, I'll say the general interpretation is the treaty mandates three things. Countries with nuclear weapons at the time, China, France, Soviet Union, US, and UK, committed to good faith efforts to reduce their stockpiles with the eventual goal of general and complete disarmament. Countries without nuclear weapons committed not to pursuing them, and then all countries in good standing with the treaty would have access to civil nuclear technology. Though imperfect, this treaty has prevented the proliferation once feared and kept pressure on countries with nuclear weapons, particularly the Soviet Union, subsequently Russia, and the United States, to reduce and restrict their arsenals through a series of treaties and other legally binding agreements. Throughout these years, public involvement was actually essential to progress. Millions of people marched in the streets around the world demanding their leaders work to reduce nuclear threats. Thousands of people then devoted their careers to meeting those demands. The NPT's indefinite extension in 1995, achieved through a myriad of further commitments to reducing nuclear threats, seemed like the full validation of a path away from nuclear weapons. 30 years later, that consensus is now buried under rampant distrust and broken or unkept promises. Treaties were abandoned or violated. Disarmament bodies became frustratingly deadlocked. Models of stability were undermined, and the public turned its attention to other risks. But nuclear threats do not manage themselves or diminish for lack of attention. Many in the nuclear policy community now say we are at the start of a third nuclear age. The first age running from 45 to roughly 91, marked by discovery, proliferation and buildups, and the near daily fear of nuclear war. The second age running up until now was marked by massive arms reductions, two distinct proliferation challenges from North Korea and Iran, and the fear of nuclear terrorism. The third age, some are quick to predict, will be marked by an arms buildup hastened by a burgeoning arms race driven by great power competition. One could posit that it is a bit premature, if not cavalier, to predict how an entire age will unfold before it's actually happened. That said, if a world chock full of more nukes is what we want, it's hard to argue that we're not well on our way to that reality. So the question is, what do we actually want? I would say we don't have anything close to a shared consensus on that. So it's time for an overdue level set. The exploration of the power of the atom may have rendered the creation of nuclear weapons inevitable, but no one actually asked the citizens of the world if they would like to create and sustain a security structure predicated on the potential swift and total annihilation of humankind. If they had been asked, it's likely that they would have preferred a different option. In fact, the majority of countries on this planet have now acceded to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that seeks to ban the use and possession of nuclear weapons. For almost all of those countries, the TPNW is the third iteration of that commitment to a nuclear-free world, the other two being the NPT and several regional nuclear weapons-free zone treaties. These commitments clearly indicate widespread support for continuing the disarmament work of the last half-century. However, the majority of humans on this planet live in a country that has nuclear weapons or is covered by a nuclear umbrella. In assessing their security needs, the leaders of these countries and their populations see the need for deterrence that nuclear weapons in theory provide, and for some, even the need for more nuclear weapons. The keys to moving forward here towards a safer world is knowing whether the latter group remains committed to the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons, and if every country is actually willing to do the difficult work to reach that goal. Those who do not think the end goal of a world without nuclear weapons is the right one for global security should be making that case out loud in public and without euphemisms or what Carol Cohn once described as techno-strategic jargon. Those who support disarmament but are not willing to take on the potential political or economic burdens that will likely accompany that pursuit should also be truthful about their true level of commitment. It's with that overt and abject honesty that those arguing over the future of nuclear weapons will understand the contours and the nature of the debate and prepare accordingly. And with this long overdue level set, how do we move forward? With all cards on the table, reinvigorated discourse on the future of non-proliferation, arms control, deterrence, and disarmament would be a next logical step. Of course, the current discourse on these issues is often siloed, pun intended, or combative. So the task at hand will be to find a way to start talking with each other again, not at each other or past each other or behind each other's backs. Perspectives on nuclear risks vary widely depending on circumstance. While not usually invoked in serious academic discussions, I will posit that empathy and understanding would be welcome additions to a broader goal-oriented discussion on reducing nuclear threats. I can say from my experience inside and outside the government, the refusal to acknowledge different perspectives is an impediment to useful action. With a more rigorous conversation underway, the process of finding common ground can begin. Given that a long-term consensus about the future of nuclear weapons will take time and effort to forge, the short-term common goal, I would posit, should be the prevention of nuclear war. I hope that that is a common goal. I'm going to assume it is for the sake of our conversation today. With that as the common goal, it's important to then ask if the controls that we have created to prevent nuclear war are still fit for purpose. Here, I think you would find a point of agreement across the ideological spectrum that the system we built is not working, and it could be the reason that our luck does finally run out. One can then ask, What's the process rebuilding or building a new system? I would say it starts by maintaining the norm against proliferation, as increasing the numbers of nuclear armed states would probably increase the statistical likelihood of nuclear war. Non-proliferation is held by and large, with only 9 states in possession of nuclear arsenals, but the norm is fading every day. In the past, countries considering the potential acquisition of nuclear weapons would often do so in secret, quietly, behind closed doors. Now, experts and leaders like countries like Poland, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Turkey, Canada, and even Japan openly discuss and debate going nuclear. Going forward, countries have to discuss the factors that are driving others to consider the nuclear option, including the undermining of extended nuclear deterrence, work to mitigate and alter those factors, and work to strengthen the safeguards and structures that impede progress towards the bomb. Those safeguards and structures may be complex and expensive to maintain, but they serve a greater good. As I said, the likelihood of nuclear war goes up every time a new nuclear state is born. And I know someone would object to my view, noting that friendly proliferation might actually be beneficial. For argument's sake, let's unpack that idea of friendly proliferation first. Friendly is entirely in the eye of the beholder. Is North Korea an example of friendly proliferation from the perspective of the Chinese or the Russians? Further, once the norm against proliferation is truly broken, where does it end? Who gets to arbitrate what is and is not friendly? Further, friends don't always stay friends. So let's not forget who sold Iran its first research reactor. More to talk about in the discussion, to be sure. Overall, new strains on embattled non-proliferation infrastructure may cause the nuclear threat landscape to further deteriorate. Many think that nuclear energy can be a bridge to a cleaner environment and a source for the huge electricity demands of artificial intelligence systems. That may well be the case, but as India, Pakistan, and North Korea has shown, a civil nuclear capacity can also be a nuclear weapons starter kit. To limit proliferation, a massive expansion of civil nuclear technology will require more resources and more support for the non-proliferation infrastructure and a broad public conversation about the importance of investing in proliferation-resistant technologies. Now, for arms control. As efforts to restrain nuclear weapons proliferation continue, the set of tools that collectively make up the notion of arms control should be used to manage existing nuclear weapons. Arms control options include unilateral or parallel transparency and confidence building measures, bilateral and multilateral dialogue, scientific exchanges and cooperation, mill-to-mill cooperation, political agreements, and of course, legally binding treaties. We tend to only focus on that last one, but arms control is actually a lot of different tools. And these tools have been used for great effect over the past 80 years. But countries need to acknowledge that not every tool is applicable for every circumstance, and there is no such thing as a perfect arms control measure. After all, arms control measures are not intended to be permanent solutions, but rather, as a former head of ACTA once said, they're a way to buy time to ultimately change behavior to reduce the threat of nuclear war. Measures will weaken and erode if not properly tended. Sometimes changing circumstances will mean arms control measures no longer function as designed, but that's not an indication that the tools themselves lack value. Now, I'm very aware of the trope that says we should avoid arms control for arms control's sake. To be clear, I have never been actually able to identify an instance where anyone was actually doing arms control for arms control's sake. Those who do not think an arms control measure is possible or necessary when dealing with a particular problem should just be direct about their reasoning. Dispensing with straw men is going to save us all a lot of time and reduce friction. For the short-term goal of preventing nuclear war, countries can pursue a variety of arms control efforts, including increased transparency about and monitoring of nuclear arsenals, as well as enhanced arrangements for communications during crises. As part of that process, nuclear armed states must be engaging in dialogues about their respective nuclear deterrence postures and doctrines, making some good headway about that in the previous administration, and I hope that this administration will continue to prioritize such dialogues. Misunderstandings and misperceptions about intentions are only going to increase the chance of nuclear catastrophe. When discussing the future of deterrence, I will posit that effective policies will require a radically expanded debate that includes academic and political leaders. The circle of people discussing deterrence theory and practice has grown rather insular over the years. Indeed, some who believe in the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence have drawn into a closed circle, portraying their views as representative of a broad public consensus and dismissing critiques as naive or uneducated. On the other side of the debate, some call for the wholesale rejection of deterrence, summarily dismissing any role it has played in maintaining stability and security in the nuclear age. As long as countries possess nuclear weapons, it is useful and necessary to build a real consensus about how we manage stability and prevent nuclear use. Such a consensus will likely require a return to basics of what is deterrence? Does everyone have a common definition? What would it actually mean if deterrence fails? Have we thought enough about how deterrence will work with multiple adversaries and in a three-way competition? How many nuclear weapons is ever actually enough? Further, renewed U.S. interest in homeland missile defenses, given that, scientifically sound review of any potential new investments, as well as a refresher on the relationship between offensive and defensive systems would not only be timely, it is essential. In that vein, we must explore whether deterrence policies are unduly influenced by a military-industrial complex that stands to gain financially from arms racing. A real consensus on managing the nuclear threat must also include the human factor. Do the autocratic leanings of many of the men who possess the power to start a nuclear war affect their likelihood to do so? Do we have a good idea of how these men, and they are all men, would respond to pressure and potential escalation? Will they act calmly and be guided by rational and scientifically sound advice, or will they be driven by paranoia or desire for power? Perhaps it's time to truly debate whether any single individual should have the power to start a nuclear war. There are also uncomfortable but central questions that have been avoided due to political sensitivities. Are China and the United States mutually vulnerable in terms of nuclear attack? That is a conversation that people are loath to have. Should North Korea be treated like a proliferation problem now that it has an established nuclear arsenal and a growing set of delivery systems? Is the world even capable of moving away from a security structure based on mutually assured destruction? At the core of the deterrence discussions, countries will need to acknowledge that deterrence is not an end in itself, but as with arms control, a measure to buy time to change behavior. Or you could debate that, but it is a debatable point. I would maintain that arms control and deterrence are in fact mutually reinforcing, and not just because I took part in a nuclear posture review process that endorsed that idea. I would say both are necessary for global security, at least until there is a consensus and the ability to move past nuclear arsenals. On disarmament, while working towards a broader discussion of deterrence, the world must also consider the future of disarmament efforts. This topic requires a more rigorous debate than now exists. That debate can start with the critical question about why the post-Cold War push for a world without nuclear weapons lost momentum. Was it a lack of political will or urgency, resistance from those with vested interests in the status quo, or a disbelief in the idea that the goal was actually achievable? Is it possible to better frame the pursuit of nuclear disarmament, not as an unachievable fantasy, but as a legitimate security proposal? Is a world without nuclear weapons a safer world? Or is it one in which we've simply replaced nuclear weapons with a different but equally dangerous weapon? How will global security be managed in a world without nuclear weapons? What will disincentivize conventional war on a broad scale in the absence of nuclear deterrence? Can we ensure upon reaching zero that the state of disarmament is truly irreversible? Some of these questions are being debated, but not by nearly enough people and by far too few perspectives. Many disarmament structures created with the best intent long ago ceased to function. Many of these structures, including the largely moribund Conference on Disarmament, were created through 3 UN special sessions on disarmament held from the late 1970s to the late 1980s. Some observers have posited that after more than 30 years, it's time for another such session to adapt and repurpose what was built. There is resistance to such an effort, with many experts saying there is no chance of improving conditions in the international discourse on nuclear threats, and a high likelihood that it would make the situation worse. At the same time, the fear of failure, the fear of losing what was built before, could be our undoing. While it will take time and likely inordinate amounts of patience to build a new global consensus, the reality is that the only way to truly prevent nuclear war is to eliminate nuclear weapons once and for all. Of course, there's no shortcut to a world without nuclear weapons, and no grand bargain on nuclear disarmament in the offing, which is why we will have to make our own luck. The academics, experts, and policymakers that will undertake the non-pro arms control deterrence and disarmament work of this new nuclear age will face obstacles in many directions and new and unprecedented challenges. We will also need to understand how other existential risks, climate change, emerging and disruptive technologies, to include synthetic biology and artificial intelligence, among others, will affect their work for good and bad. That means reaching out beyond the nuclear community of arms controllers, nuclear hawks, non-pro experts, and disarmers to communities that have no idea what those divisions even are. It can start by reading things like the Bulletin. I can tell you at the State Department in my last stint, I would get the newsletter and I'd see all the nuclear articles and I was trying to track what was going on, but I'd find myself going into the other categories, climate change, disruptive tech. It was useful for even understanding the challenges that I was thinking about in the nuclear space. And now that I get to talk to some of the smartest minds in climate and disruptive tech, it's clear we have to join forces sooner rather than later because these risks are increasingly linked together. We'll also need to push against status quo thinking, given that's the thinking that got us here and created these current dangers. I encourage you to ask the question, why? In this process. At State, I discovered we had carried a US policy for 30 years, and no one actually had a good reason for it. And we would have probably maintained it had I not asked the question, why? So we cannot be afraid to challenge the status quo, to rock the boat ever so slightly. I would also contend that everyone working on these issues must accept that progress will likely only be achieved through a plodding, frustrating, and iterative set of steps underpinned by scientific endeavor and sustained political will, some of which can be easily controlled and some of which cannot. Among the more important lessons to be learned in the last 80 years is a straightforward one. Nothing is certain, but nothing is preordained either. Humankind is capable of its own destruction, but also of its own salvation. None of the aforementioned questions will be easy to answer, nor the suggested efforts would be easy to implement. But difficulty is not an excuse for inaction. Albert Einstein gave a speech in '48, it was printed in the Bulletin. In it, he lamented that people were aware of the nuclear threat, but that only a few act accordingly. At the dawn of this new nuclear age, only a few are aware of that danger that surrounds them each and every day. That's why we must continue to engage in a civil and scientifically sound debate on the ethical, military, political, and scientific aspects of global nuclear threats and their potential solutions, and then work together to implement those solutions. Make no mistake, now is the time to act accordingly. The third nuclear age will be what we make of it. Our luck could run out, or we could figure out a way to make our own luck. I hope you choose the latter path. Thank you.
I'll keep a list. I saw Ron's hand first.
Okay. Thank you. There are two problems with nuclear disarmament. The first is, since we've produced about 100,000 nuclear weapons, give or take, and we never really had a precise count, what if somebody had squirreled away 100 or so weapons, which can be very small near the end, and nobody knows where they are or if they are? And the second is, we have a large nuclear power industry, and despite what everybody says, you can make nuclear weapons out of nuclear power, perhaps more expensively, less efficiently, but you can do it. So those are the two problems. What do you think?
Only two?
We solved those. I'll start with nuclear energy. I was actually just talking to Vipin about this. I had been talking to a climate expert who just, despite being a climate expert, hadn't really thought of the implications of the expansion of civil nuclear technology and asked me, or sort of posited, are you saying that as long as nuclear power exists, there'll always be the threat of nuclear proliferation? I said, yes. And she was like, wait, forever? Forever, ever? And I was like, yes, as long as we are using this technology, it can be repurposed, as you said. But that's exactly why you have to invest and maintain the structures that exist to control civil nuclear technologies. This is something that does cost money and does take political will and patience to maintain. The IAEA doesn't magically exist on its own. Countries have sort of forgotten about the importance of investing in these structures, investing in safeguards and export controls. This is a problem for all of us. There are ways to manage it, but we can't just pretend that that's not a problem. And I think that's what some of the weak points of the disarmament debate is not thinking about the long-term problem and the fact that if you were to reach a zero state, that is a state that you're not done. You're never done. It will always cost money and take political will and effort to maintain that zero state. So again, why I sort of posit that there should be more thinking about what's happening on that other side. There are actually some very interesting debates happening about irreversibility in multilateral fora, and the idea that irreversibility is actually a series of measures that overlap each other to try to create an impenetrable wall between countries and nuclear acquisition. But that would require every country in the world participating in some way. As I said, I'm not sure that every country supporting disarmament actually understands what they would be committing themselves to in terms of time and investment. On the how do you ensure zero, I have no idea. But if that is the direction you're going in, the lower the numbers go, the higher the importance of verification, the need for compliance, the need to have penalties for lack of compliance. All of that has to be a part of the conversation. The lower the numbers go, the harder the process gets. And if that's the direction everybody wants to go in, again, they have to commit to that rigorous intellectual process to figure out how to maintain things. I often hear, though, you can't put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. I have no idea why people use this metaphor. Genies are literally meant to go back in bottles. Like, that's what they do. And then when I say that, people are like, you can't put toothpaste back in a tube. And I was like, no, you can't. But you can clean up the mess and you can screw that lid on tight and you can make sure that toothpaste is up on a shelf. So whoever...
see my kids.
Well, you make sure it's up on a shelf where people can't reach it. But the idea that there's no way to prevent things, I think, is a certain lack of creativity and commitment. If this is the direction that we want to go in collectively as a international community, then you slowly find the ways. But there's no shortcut to it. It would require more knowledge and more cooperation than is currently available to us.
Thanks. Professor Caitlin.
Thank you, Professor Pippin. Thanks for a very interesting talk. One thing I didn't hear you mention was Ukraine. And I want to ask you what you think we can learn about escalation dynamics from what we've seen over the last few years, because this war obviously has had some nuclear dimensions to it, obviously most in fall 2022, but even beyond that. And so I wanted to ask you first, with your expert, government official analyst hat on, what you think we should take away from what we've observed in that conflict. And then secondly, given your role as an advocate and sort of having your finger on the pulse of a kind of public opinion on nuclear weapons and public debates, what do you think the public has taken away from the Ukraine war as far as what it means about nuclear weapons? Because it has definitely spiked interest, but what do you think people interpret it to mean?
I might make the case that most Americans haven't really thought that much about Ukraine.
I don't mean just Americans. I'm actually interested sort of in maybe non-Americans even, because they're relevant to some of the dynamics you're discussing.
No, and I and it's not to disparage like Americans. There are a lot of things to be thinking about, worrying about. And then I think those of us in the foreign policy, international security space don't always do a very good job of explaining why these things that seem to be happening far away actually do matter for us. But I think, multiple issues, and I get asked this all the time, is sort of like, well, isn't this proof that Ukraine shouldn't have given up its nuclear weapons? And I was like, okay, well, let's talk about like the process. There were nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil. And I feel like I'm going down the wrong, saying this in front of an expert on these issues. But, if Ukraine had decided back in the early 90s, like, no, we're going to try to keep these nukes, I'm guessing there would have been a problem at the time that would have been quite severe. But the Ukrainians made a deal in the form of the Budapest Memorandum to return those nuclear weapons to Russian soil in exchange for sovereign integrity. And when people ask me, well, shouldn't have Ukraine done this? I was like, why aren't we focusing on shouldn't have Russia held up its end of the deal? Why are we not talking about the fact that Russia specifically did the thing that they said they would not do? Any of that crap they've been saying about their justification. They violated an agreement that they had made. And then I hear the argument of like, isn't this proof that countries need nuclear weapons to protect themselves? And I think that can apply to Ukraine. It can also apply to a lot of other countries that the U.S. has invaded and or bombed. And I do worry about whether or not we have ourselves incentivized countries to think maybe this is the way that we provide for our own protection. I will say Ukrainian officials have along the way said we endorse the choice that was made. Kind of goes back and forth sometimes. But overall, I think that problem would have been a problem sooner had those weapons not been transferred. But I do think, like, as far as the escalation dynamics, I think it's brought people back into a conversation about how quickly things can escalate, how misreading each other, the Russian targeting of Engels and how that affected the U.S.-Russia bilateral discussions about New START, the concerns that the whole world was having about I wouldn't even call it like saber rattling. Putin was just out loud threatening nuclear use as a means of deterrence. Kind of makes the case that deterrence works both ways. That I kept hearing the term self-deterred, and I was like, isn't that just being deterred? Like, isn't it like that is the nature of deterrence, is that it works both ways. But what I hope it does more broadly is bring regional experts, Euro-Atlantic experts, back into a conversation about nuclear deterrence that they left a long time ago. And that, nuclear issues isn't just having somebody on the backbench to come to the table, which was a literal thing that happened to me. Like every once in a while at the State Department, they were like, nope, nerd, come to the table. Now you say something, now you go back to the back. We got what we needed from you. I think there needs to be a better integration of the communities working on regional threat dynamics and the people working on nuclear issues in those regions. So that was a really long answer without probably a good answer, but.
Go on.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. I was thinking about your discussion on ossified thinking, and it got me thinking about the Bulletin. And it seems to me your, in our terms, dependent variable is this doomsday clock, which makes perfect sense in the first age, begins to break down in the second age where we're not thinking about Armageddon. We're thinking more regional. We're talking about some type of nuclear terrorism. And so I always thought that the doomsday as a DV could potentially constrain intellectually the type of discussion, which I think may have framed your argument here that nuclear war is nuclear war, we got to avoid it. Whereas those who work in this space recognize the fact that the concerns, more likelihood is not an Armageddon, but some more type of limited use. And so it may be to your advantage. I mean, I look at, you've got an analog clock here, which, seems to represent the fact of 1947 thinking rather than third age. So I want your reflections on how your position and being in the Bulletin might constrain your ability to think outside of a doomsday versus non-doomsday approach to the nuclear space.
I don't think it constrains thinking because it's not a box in which we've locked ourselves in. It's a metaphor for the state of risks that exists. And so the doomsday came.
For what? Risk of what?
So the way we describe it is the atomic scientists of Chicago formed the Bulletin felt that now that humankind possessed the capability to destroy civilization as we know it, there needed to be a conversation, not an academic conversation exclusively. Of course, people like Oppenheimer and Einstein could have had a peer-reviewed journal, do whatever they want. They're Einstein and Oppenheimer, but they wanted to have a magazine specifically to connect scientists, policymakers, and the public in a conversation about, again, the military, ethical, environmental, diplomatic, environmental consequences of nuclear war. And the clock, the first, I always think about it like the first appearance of Spider-Man. The first appearance of the Doomsday Clock was in June 47. And it was actually Martia Langsdorff, a wife of a Manhattan Project scientist, who wanted to visually represent risk. And even kids today, like mostly I still have an analog watch, but that's because I had to spend a lot of times in windowless skiffs. And there's really no torture on earth worse than being in a windowless skiff without a clock in a meeting that is interminable. So getting a watch.
Stuck with Austin.
Getting a watch. Austin always made cogent points. There's some people who took a long time to make a point. But the symbol itself, I think, people still relate to, and we know this because millions of people, tune in to the clock. My job, as I see it, is trying to connect those people who are familiar with the Doomsday Clock, who listen to the reports, who asked about it, and then get them to read the Bulletin. Now, as far as the expansion of the focus, so it did start with nuclear risks. But then it expanded. Our first article on climate change was actually in 78. So we're a bit of ahead of the curve of the discussion of climate change as an existential risk. And so that was incorporated. This was yet the way we were changing our environment was yet another way that humans could destroy their own civilization. Disruptive technologies was added, that you could say that nuclear weapons are in fact the first disruptive technology in our modern thinking of it. These disruptive technologies themselves might not be the catalyst for an existential crisis, but they can exacerbate the other problems that we have. Of course, AI being, the big focus point a lot, but generally the Doomsday Clock is decided by a series of experts in all of those disciplines. And what I think is most valuable about the conversation is the overlap between them, the discussion that happens between experts who are usually never in a room together. And all I can say, I've only, last November was my first rodeo in terms of the discussion. And what I really took away from it is we need to be doing this more everywhere. Experts in these fields need to be talking to each other, talking about how these risk areas overlap, exacerbate each other, or tools inside each of those that could be used, to help things. So I've heard a lot of, you were talking about the analog clock. I've heard people say that we should be using a sundial, that we should be using a digital clock, that we should be using Bayesian statistical analysis to come up with a percentage, and that would be better. I think all of those are valid, and if people want to try them, they should. The Doomsday Clock still connects with people, and as long as it's bringing in a conversation, bringing people into a conversation that they may have left or never been in the first place, I think it's a value add. I would say my, and I push the team on this all the time, is I don't want to just be talking about the threats. I always want to pair the threats with their potential solutions. And I, iterate that over and over again. Like, I don't believe the clock is there to scare people. Even if it does, the clock should be, interpreted as this is an analysis of the current risk, immediately followed by, and here's how we, move back. In this year's clock discussion, I think one of the main features is we knew all the risks coming into that year's discussion. These were the same risks we've been dealing with. What we see is an obviation of leadership, an apathy or purposeful unwillingness to not try to solve these threats. And that was a major thing that we were trying to draw attention to this year, is that we know what the threats are, we know what the potential solutions are. Nobody is doing anything. And that's what's really driving the level of risk and where the clock is set.
Emily Dunn.
Yeah, I have what is sort of an offshoot to your answer to Caitlin's question, which is, Russia invades Ukraine, violates the Budapest Agreement. The US leaves the JCPOA. We execute a preemptive strike on Iran. Russia illegally suspends New Start. We let New Start expire. We don't respond, to my knowledge, of their offer to extend central limits. So it seems like right now, and as somebody who worked in arms control, I hate the line of arms control is dead, but it does seem like arms control is incredibly difficult right now, because simultaneously with both the US and Russia having undermined both arms control and non-proliferation agreements recently, combined with the security environment and trying to bring China into arms control negotiations that they have no interest in being, what is the path forward to that? Is there any like interim measures or efforts that you can see as a possible way to sort of rebuild that trust and that cooperation to get to arms control again? Big question, but
The answer is yes. But I don't think it's a bad thing to see that we don't have a lot of clear paths to arms control treaties right now. And I think, you know, that the time it will take to rebuild, you know, some of these processes, you know, the next legally binding treaty may be a way off, or it could be around the corner, because sort of the nature of these issues is you never know when something will slide or move into place. And so what I think we should focus on is, what are all the tools available to us? Are any of these tools applicable for any of these issues? I was glad to see the Trump administration restart mill-to-mill dialogues with the Chinese. You know, I had hopes actually for the upcoming, now delayed summit between Putin and Xi, because I actually think both of them could potentially be interested in a sort of transactional approach to maybe some small measures, better crisis communication, hotline, a ballistic missile launch notification agreement. The key is to not say, you know, oh, it's dead, it's done. And it's like, it's not a living thing. It's a set of tools. You use the tools or you don't use the tools. But you should be aware of what's available to you, creative in how you approach it, but also acknowledging that sometimes you're going to try and try and try and nothing will work. And then a breakthrough. It took, what, 9 years to negotiate the INF treaty? They literally made a play about how terrible it was. And like, if you ever seen a walk in the wood, definitely watch it. It was depressing. And there were just years where nothing was coming of those conversations. But we kept talking and we found a way through. And I think what's dangerous right now is the lack of talking, the lack of trying. I think we need to be willing to fail until we find something that works. And it's an actual relatively minor investment in terms of investments that we could, you know, be making, and just simply being at the table and talking to each other. The Chinese, for example, in the P5 dialogue that I was leading for the US, they would laundry list through all the bad things that we did. And it's a very long list. We do lots of bad things in the eyes of the Chinese. But one of the things they listed as they were laundry listing was, and you have a nuclear triad. And I was like, blah, 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 blah. Wait, you guys have a nuclear triad. And they were like, yes, yours is so much bigger than ours. And I was like, okay, so it's not actually the 3 separate delivery systems for nuclear weapons that you find problematic. It's what you perceive as a disparity in the size of our forces. And they're like, yeah. I was like, okay, you could take that one off the list. And the next time we had a meeting, they did not list that in their very angry set of things. And I was like, we made progress, a tiny, ridiculous piece of progress. But like, that can only be done by meeting the same people in the room, having, you know, keeping those diplomatic conversations, not at, you know, in the headlines, keeping them together, creating a relationship with people. Like, that is how we got somewhere with the Russians. It took us decades to find a way. It's the kind of investment process that we have to make with the Chinese and others, and start making it again with the Russians. And yeah, we can both do the Spider-Man meme where we're pointing at each other. And I think you have to build in an airing of grievances in every kind of meeting like this. And it's really intolerable. I was just telling Vipin how many times the Russians have thrown, well, you withdrew from the ABM treaty. And I was like, yeah, so I was in the Peace Corps. You know, it was like, yeah, I was in the southwest coast of Jamaica working with fishermen. George W. Bush did not call and consult with me about whether or not I thought it would be a good idea to withdraw from ABM. I would have said, no, don't do it. But it's done. What do you want? A new ABM treaty? And I've actually never had a Russian official or an NGO person actually say, yes, we want the exact ABM treaty over again. Because in the meantime, Russia has made their own investments in missile defense, where I think we were getting, before they chose war over diplomacy, in the strategic stability conversations we're having, was the Russians coming around to the idea that maybe there was finally something we could do in missile defense that was not legally binding, that they would find beneficial. But that was only happening because we kept talking about it and kept letting them yell at us about it and finding a way through. It's just arms control is hard, and a lot of it doesn't work. But it doesn't mean it's not necessary.
Barry.
So you said, you invoked the term MAD, mutual assured destruction. And I'm going to ask a couple questions here, not because I want to argue with you, but I'm actually just trying to figure out what it is you think. So MAD could mean two things. At one time, it was argued that MAD was a doctrinal thing. Nuclear states would believe in it, and they would organize their forces to ensure that, mutual assured destruction would happen, and that was the main thing they organized their forces for. This was never true, of course, but it was a belief for a while in nuclear strategy. Then there's another way of thinking about it, which is to say, look, the best will in the world, all the money in the world, all the talent in the world that the superpowers threw at trying to win nuclear exchanges didn't help them that much, and that any actual exchange would have resulted in something that looks like mutual assured destruction. And that there was some sort of deep consciousness of this that would begin to affect behaviors as actors approach the brink. And therefore, MAD meant something in a different way, as a fact of life that worked like a kind of field of force, a magnetic thing, right? And I'm wondering, which version do you subscribe to? I mean, would you, for example, think that states really don't like MAD, they don't accept MAD, but it would be better if they did, and let's organize our first arms control efforts around institutionalizing MAD? Or do you think this is like a waste of time? MAD is where they are, right? Arms control should not be focusing on this nickel and dime stuff. We should really be focusing on big and meaningful paths towards total reduction. So I'm asking you to riff on MAD a little bit. Maybe I've said too much, but tell me what you think.
No, and the nickel and diming point, hits because I've had, disarmament advocates at times say that, you're not thinking about the big picture if you're just focusing on things like New START. And, to my counter is like, it's that iterative process that will get us where we're going. In the meantime, it's providing, stability and predictability, which has value in and of itself. On MAD, I got to be part of the New START ratification process. And I remember Senator DeMint from South Carolina, who then went to the Heritage Foundation, was saying we should reject the theory of mutually assured destruction, and that would be better if we simply rejected it. And there was forceful pushback in the room, but to me, at the time thinking about it, I was like, I don't think it's something you can choose or unchoose. The United States and Russia possess the capabilities to destroy the other country and, fully and completely, and take the rest of the world with us. That's just that's a reality. And so it's always strange to me that it was something you could choose or unchoose, without choosing or unchoosing to have those large arsenals capable of providing. So I guess it's sort of the latter. But overall, do I think that we need to reinvigorate the conversations we were having, 30, 40, 50 years ago? Yes. But do I think that we need to that's where I think that the constraints are, is that we're, sort of looking, okay, we're going to think about this theory, or we're going to think about, the one example that we can, point to in terms of build up to build down with the INF issue. I was like, okay, let's explore that idea. But all of the factors that led to a buildup of missiles in Europe, and then subsequently the INF treaty, can we actually recreate all those circumstances? Let's actually debate that. Let's debate some of these original thinking and see how it applies. In a three-way system. This is what's lacking, is the number of people in rooms that are not self-described nuclear nerds actually talking about this. And so it's not even a conversation just among this community. As I was talking to Vipin earlier, it's also a conversation that we need to bring other people back into, including, just our security structure being predicated on that threat that leaves something to chance.
Kelly Greenhill, who just walked out. Okay. Charlie.
She didn't let my mad answer.
Charlie.
Hi, thank you. I have one quick comment and one question. So my comment is, I actually, as you sort of try to form the shape of the nuclear discourse, I would suggest you take disarmament off the table. It's not going to happen. There's good reasons it's not going to happen. It's incredibly far away. And people have spent, contrary, I think, to what you suggested, people have spent a tremendous amount of time studying it, and the debate is pretty well formed. I mean, it's not decided one way or the other, but it's so far in the distance, and there's so many arguments against it. I would focus my message on things that were more achievable in the foreseeable future, even for people who are young and have a long, a long distance to look at. So I would just say, I think that, maybe you need to do it at the Bulletin for, to motivate your base or whatever. But I just think it's, it's to me, it's not a strong read. I would say another thing that I was going to say, it seems to me that underpinning much of your discussion or your comments was that the idea that we need new ideas and we need to sort of work and develop new ideas. And when I look back at how we got to where we are, I don't think it's the lack of good analytic frameworks or ideas. I think there are a variety of barriers to the accomplishment of what people wanted to accomplish. And that leads me to think that if we want to make advance toward reducing the probability of nuclear war, whether through arms control or otherwise, we need to identify what those barriers are and then ask, if we can remove the barriers. But I don't think, it's just my bet. I don't know, of course, because when you don't know what the new ideas are, you don't know what they are. But my bet is it's not going to, if we're going to make progress, it won't be by new ideas. It will actually be by either changing the conditions we face or policies that enable us to change those conditions. So I'd be curious in your reactions to that and maybe what you see as the barriers to accomplishing what was laid out by a quite clear analytic agenda in the 1960s.
Yeah, I think that's why I started out with the Mort Halperin anecdote when he was like, yeah, that's great, kid, but start thinking of some new things. I get informed by the past, but not shackled to it, I think is what I'm talking about. And it's not that necessarily people will reinvent, or invent totally new ideas, but there is somewhat of a tendency in Washington to say, well, we're not all dead, so clearly everything we've done is perfect and it's working. And I think we can move past that. I think this was in my first stint at the State Department where I brought up an idea in front of some experts and they said, well, we tried that. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I thought I had properly researched this and I didn't see anything that indicated that. And they were like, well, no, it was like we tried it in 97. And I was like, oh, the year I graduated from high school, maybe let's just take another run at it. And we did, and it worked. There is a strong tendency to be like, nope, we tried that, or no, that probably won't work. And that's what I'm talking about. Not necessarily that all of a sudden someone will figure out how to make peace break out everywhere. But that we tend to stick with patterns and ideas and a drift at times into groupthink. And I think to actually figure out now, 80 years in a multipolar deterrence context, we're just going to have to allow ourselves to think a little bit more creatively. Maybe that's the thing. It's not new, but more creatively. And like I said, try things with the idea that they may not work. And you don't necessarily want to try things that make situations work, but you also don't want to be afraid to try things. In terms of disarmament, I actually see there is a security argument for disarmament, and you saw that made by Perry, Kissinger, Nunn, and Schultz, specifically in the context of nuclear terrorism, and also the idea that you needed a goal to be driving towards. I would say that most parties to the NPT think and believe that the 5 nuclear armed states recognized under the treaty are committed to pursue disarmament. Now, if that's not where we're going anymore, and I acknowledge that not everyone agrees that that's the place to go, we need to have a conversation about that and level set. because I think the majority of countries in the world think that is where we need to go. But I also think most of those countries have not talked about the questions that I was asking. Is a world without nuclear weapons a safer world? Have we simply replaced nuclear weapons with a different kind of danger and potentially more destabilizing? What would you actually do to disincentivize conventional conflict? I haven't seen anything in the necessary levels of scholarship and analytical discourse. So it's not to say that disarmament is something that's easily reachable, but I do think people are talking about it, and I do think it requires a deeper look if we're going to take it seriously as part of the discourse, as opposed to, and I do think there's a difference between abolition and disarmament, and it may be kind of subtle, but I think there's the sort of moral, idealistic view of we just shouldn't have nuclear weapons, but I'm not really concerned about how anyone manages to make that happen. I just think they should make it happen. And then there are people who are actually trying to think through the process of how we create a different security structure that is not predicated around nuclear security anymore, nuclear weapons anymore. So I get what you're saying, but I think it's a part of the conversation, certainly internationally. And so to just sort of put it to the side, I think that's the kind of situation that led to the development of the TPNW.
Dan Siebel, you have a two finger, which is your one finger also?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Hi, Daniel Siegel, fourth PhD student. Good to see you again. I just want to push you on this a little bit because I think this has been a good talk highlighting a lot of different questions and challenges that face these different sort of topics you outlined. But you keep coming back to this like, oh, well, we just need more creative solutions. Like what? Like, could you provide some examples of like some sort of creative solutions? Like, I would assume people at the Bulletin or people who write for the Bulletin are publishing things along that line. And so I just want a bit more like something tangible I can actually put my hands around and like engage with analytically about these creative solutions that would get us disarmament. You know, what would the world need to look like for that to be sustainable, et cetera, rather than this kind of like, we just need young people to have creative ideas. You know, like, can you give us something to kind of latch onto and tackle with here?
Sure. We have a general consensus that China doesn't want to do arms control because they say they don't want to do arms control. I think that there are ways that we can show them that there are, useful and tangible things in the arms control space in terms of solutions that they might find mutually beneficial. So they don't want to do, a bilateral nuclear reduction treaty with us. I actually think that we don't either. I don't think we're ready to have Chinese like PLA members in, at Minot Air Force Base. Like, I don't think we prepared for that yet. But, I think through the process of sitting and listening to them talk about no force use endlessly, I started thinking, like, what is it that you're trying to get out of a no first use policy? And I assume it's to prevent nuclear use between us. So what are the other things that we can do to potentially prevent nuclear use between us? Crisis communication would be one of those things. Or if they don't like the front door, can we go through a side door like a ballistic missile launch notification agreement that's bilateral, that suits their needs because they don't like the amount of time we notify. But if we have a launch notification agreement with us, it would actually allow us to establish a NERC line between Beijing and Washington that could be used for other purposes if we need it. The Nuclear Risk Reduction Center is a facility at State Department that takes in data notifications, secure communications from countries around the world, most importantly Russia. When the Pentagon was damaged in 9/11, it damaged the part of the building that actually connected the Pentagon to the Kremlin. So the message from the United States that we were changing DEFCON levels actually went from the NERC to the Russians. And the thing about that I like the most, the NERC director once said, I can't guarantee you that the Russians aren't lying to you, but I can guarantee you it is the Russians on the other end of the line. And that in and of itself has value. So sort of, whether it's a launch notification agreement, but I also think it's sort of the creative solutions come in working the problem. The issue of dirty bombs was coming up in the context of Ukraine. So one of the things the State Department thought about was whether or not we could pick up a thing that had been left on the table. So not new thinking, but something that had been left on the table in the early 80s, which is a ban on the state-based use of radiological weapons. We went around looking about, like, why did we leave that on the table? And it's because the US and Russia started getting busy with other things, most distinctly bilateral agreements. So we picked the ball back up. We took it to the UN First Committee. We had countries saying, oh, no, like, Iran will just make trouble, like, don't try. Trying is the first step towards failure. And we managed to get countries on board. When we dropped the resolution, the first country to co-sign was Ukraine, saying, yes, we have found a way to put this issue back into, the broader discussion. And now 164 countries agree that we should negotiate a ban on the state-based use of radiological weapons. Seems like something we should have done a long time ago. But, it's sort of, I could like just go like pinpointing things, but the process of sitting and talking and working through problems, understanding each other's doctrines and postures is where the ideas come up. So there's an endless amount of ideas, some of which are completely just rehashing stuff that came before, but you've got to create opportunities along the way. So I'm happy to dig in with you after the fact. I'm not just saying it like, oh, like if we just simply like try, like something will happen. What I'm saying is we're not trying at all. And it's the longer these problems go, I think it goes to a question maybe that Caitlin asked earlier, is the thing about Ukraine shows me just problems don't go away because you don't want to have to deal with them. Crimea was a very big signal that Russia was moving in a direction, and we kind of just like were hoping not to. And I remember INF violation came up at the same time. European allies were like, oh my God, can you guys handle this INF thing? We already have enough problems with Crimea. We don't want to deal with this other problem that you've now dropped on our doorstep. And then looking back, I think a lot of those countries would be like, yeah, I wish we would have tried harder on that whole INF thing back when you asked us to help us on the INF thing. The same thing with Crimea. Like, I think looking now, like I look at Israel-Palestine. There was a deal on the table in '94. It wasn't a great deal. I think both sides didn't like aspects of it, but it was a far better situation than we're in now because we just kept thinking there was something better down the horizon. So I think, creating opportunities for ourselves and taking the time to act when openings appear, or being ready for when openings appear, and not assuming that we can just wait. And that eventually, I've had countries say, like when I've briefed them about the Chinese nuclear buildup, they're like, oh, maybe China just needs to get the same number of nukes and then you can do arms control. And I was like, so your plan is for us to wait for 10 years and have China, massively increase the size of its arsenal, and then we'll do something? Because that seems easier, because that's the world that we understand, is having a similarly sized force. Like, let's get creative about what asymmetric arms control would look like. And that's where you find the creativity, sometimes because you're forced into finding it. But like, you just have to be open to the ideas that there are ways to solve these things. We haven't found them yet, but it's our responsibility to be doing the analysis and scholarship along the way, and not just like wait for the ideas to pop into the ephemera, from the ephemera.
And bilateral strategic arms control is driven by a principle largely at parity, not exact parity. But at 3, what does that look like, right? So if it's not parity, like, what is the principle that drives?
Yeah. Which is like what I mean, and I want people writing things in the bulletin for that. I want a broad discourse. I don't think I would like push back on the idea that we're catering to a base. I think there's a broad spectrum of people who are reading the bulletin, but I would like to expand the number of people who are publishing from around the world in the bulletin to create a more vibrant discourse on these issues. And if people don't think that 0 is the place to go, I want that article in the bulletin.
Andrew Howard.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm a first-year PhD student. Flipping Emily's question on its head and looking at nuclear modernization today, I wanted to know if you find that there are any aspects of American nuclear modernization that are undermining the luck that you reference. I'm a submarine officer, so there are wrong answers.
I
I'm gonna burn myself for this.
had a lot of military advisors along the way, and I did take the time to go and visit, sort of all parts of the triad along the way. One, for my own edification, but two, because I wanted, if we were in the business of trying to get somewhere with the Russians, I wanted to be talking directly to the people who were actually going to have to, be the recipients of an inspection, what had worked in the past, what hadn't worked in the past. And I will admit we had a running competition about what the coolest leg of the triad is. It's the boomers. But
We love all our children equally.
I mean, like B2s are really awesome. But
if I had to pick,
yeah, no, but what I, was specifically focused on is making sure that we at state that we're thinking about these policies understood the perspectives of the people, that would be, sort of affected by any negotiations. And part of that was, the process of just understanding how we are modernizing the arsenal at the time, a one-for-one replacement. I think, certainly the Russians would maintain, certain things we were doing, they found problematic, but, there was a lot on the other side that we could point to. I had a Russian general, this was in a track 1.5 conversation, when I brought up the ridiculousness of Poseidon. First, he called it a science experiment. And I was like, a science experiment that creates a radioactive tsunami, kill civilians. And he was like, well, maybe. But then he said, what are you going to trade us for it? And I said, nothing. We long ago got out of the habit of trading system for system and decided that the best way to sort of, do this is that we, maintain forces that work for us, and then we talk to each other about it. And then Linton Brooks, he won't mind me saying this, he was just amazing and has the best quips in the world, responded, and he said, yes, Alex is exactly right. For example, we have better subs, you have more ICBMs, and it was like the modifier was just so perfect there. Not better, but more. And I think, the Obama administration's program of record post New START made sense for the time. There's a lot of conversations about whether or not that's actually still fit for purpose with the new, problem of an expanding Chinese arsenal. But that's a debate that should be happening. I want members of Congress to be more conversant in these issues, to actually debate the pros and cons. The conversations we had in the NPR about the W-76-2, about the Slickamen were good conversations. I wish they were broader. I wish more people were in them, because I actually think it would make for a better conversation about what we need to do to have a safe, secure, and effective deterrent, to not have that conversation entirely behind closed doors, but actually to bring people in and sort of outline why it is that certain choices are made. And if we are, in fact, moving in the direction of expanding the U.S. arsenal, I think that's a conversation that many, many more people have to be a part of, and we have to have a conversation about, and then what? So I would say, the program of record now, I think people went through a lot of work to explain why we were doing things. I spent a lot of time explaining to allies and adversaries why we were doing the things we do. We need to put just as much care and time into any choices that we would make going forward. And also, boomers are awesome.
Can I two finger? Well, I will, because I can use it. So if the boomer leg is your favorite leg, the modernization program does not go one for one on the SSBN leg, and in fact has a 43% reduction in Trident 2s as designed. So I think this is not well understood. It is in this room because we talk about it ad nauseum. I think I probably bring it up every seminar.
You do.
But we're one for one at 21 Columbia. So are we right size even in the modernization program, given that doesn't even go one for one? How do we think about, and that's not even sort of, so we're not even talking about expansion from, sort of our current force structure. Where the modernization program is a net reduction, particularly on the SSBN. Like, so how do we think about that?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, the one for one is warhead. Like, that was the term of art being used for warheads, not delivery systems.
But even just because of launcher tube availability, it can't be, right? Because we just don't have the Tridents then to fit out the existing SLBM force. So I'm not sure Congress really understands that. So how do we think about our message? Going one for one is one thing, expanding is separate.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling Charlie before this, I've been in a room where a member of the Appropriations Committee in the House who had been voting for the nuclear triad for 30 years, asked a general, "What is the triad?" The knowledge of nuclear policy issues on the Hill is egregiously low, and in fact, I think it's a dereliction of duty.
God bless Senator Fisher.
And yes, it was not Fisher, but I think it's a dereliction of duty that you couldn't be on a security committee in the past and not have a good working knowledge of deterrence theory and the ins and outs of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. That is something that needs to be fixed. I've worked on that for a while. It's not an easy fix, but I think it would be a necessary part of having those deeper discussions. I think some of the reticence that people have about potential changes to the force is just not being a part of the full scope of the conversation that's going on, and that includes members of Congress who are sometimes simply looking at the bottom line.
We have 10 minutes left and 4 people, so I'm going to do 2 and 2, so that we get all the questions in. I've got Matthew Sharp and then Jim Walsh, and then we'll do a second round. Casper and ma'am, I'm sorry I don't know your name, but you. Joanne. So why don't we do Matthew and Jim in that order? Then Alex will respond, and we'll get the last 2.
Alex, can you talk a little bit more about the role that blame plays in this conversation that you're laying out? You mentioned the Russian example of the litany of grievances that go back to the ABM and who's to blame for each of those steps. But on the U.S. side, you see a lot of narrative in the Biden administration. I think now in the Trump administration, it continues that it's China's fault somehow for not taking up the invitation to engage in arms control. How do you see blame being used, and how does it impact differently in Beijing or Moscow or here? And what, if anything, are the implications of that for success in the way that you've laid it out?
Take another.
Yep, Jim Walsh.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to do something that's never been done before in an SSP Wednesday seminar. I'm going to make a really quick comment and then give my question. So my quick comment is, I love Charlie as a dear colleague, and you should reject everything that he said about disarmament and new ideas. Like, yeah, it's not as if we keep thinking and writing the same thing over and over and over and over again, like we did during the 90s and 2000s. But to me, the risk reduction agenda is wait for people to keep busy while we wait to have the nuclear war. So I'm not impressed by that. But that's my comment. I'm giving up my question to the gentleman next to me.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, Roger, I missed you.
I'm Roger Peterson. I don't know much about nuclear weapons. I did TA for John Mearsheimer in 1984 at the University of Chicago on nuclear weapons. And I have to
Scars you for life.
But I have actually published in 2022 an article in the Bulletin on emotions, because I'm known as emotions and war kind of guy. And I'm just reading from one of the commentators. There is something deeply offensive about a professor with, as far as I can tell, no wartime experience and probably no government policy experience, lecturing us in clinical terms. So at any rate, this is my, I will try not to lecture you in clinical terms, but the problem is there's no fear, right, of nuclear weapons. And there's no urgency. And there was fear in 1940. So it's getting on the clinical terms about emotions. Fear is a good thing, right? Or is it a bad thing of nuclear weapons? But it doesn't seem like there's any urgency at all. And how do you inculcate fear into people that might, but fear then has negative aspects as well.
Why don't you take those 2 and then we'll collect.
Yeah. I'll actually start there. There have been a lot of studies that have shown if you're just only going to throw fear at people, they tend to ostrich and sort of, throw up their hands and say, well, there's nothing I can do. And I think, the thing that I've been trying to say sort of my whole career is that people do have agency in this conversation, that every time there has been, full efforts to try to reduce nuclear risk, there was public pressure behind that, to empower scientists, experts to think through solutions, that people in fact have a bigger role in this conversation that they are sort of led to believe. I do think that fear can simply being exposed to the issues. So I know people have different opinions about the film that came out recently, House of Dynamite. But I got to watch it last summer to pre-screen it. I was asked by Netflix to pre-screen it and give my opinion. And I was at the Motion Picture Association downtown DC. There were like 4 of us in the theater, which was weird. But then the security guard came in, who I guess was like, "I'm gonna watch this movie with you guys." She did. It got to the end. I'm not gonna like spoil it, but it gets to the end and it's an unclear ending, and the theater is silent, and she just says, "What?" And I realize it's an explanation I have in my head all the time as I've come across things along the way that I've learned to like push down because I work on these issues and you can only process so much. Like when people are brought into this conversation, they tend to be scared. I've had people I went to East Henderson High School in East Flat Rock, North Carolina. I've had people contact me on Facebook. I haven't talked to. Oh yeah, beer helps too. I've had people contact me that I haven't talked to since high school and say like, is North Korea going to hit us with a nuke? Like after North Korea was cage rattling back in the first Trump administration, I've had people reach out asking me like, should I be worried about Iran? Like, people sort of, it's always been at the edge of conversations post Cold War, and I've actually been surprised at how many press hits I've gotten on Iran and North Korea. And I always want to say like, hey, you guys know Russia has like 1,550 of these just pointed at us all the time. Like there are bigger nuclear threats out there that you should also be aware of, but nobody ever wants to hear about those. And I think, the best thing I could say for our current like security environment is I think people are kind of coming back into the conversation. And so I think it's important to say, please come into this conversation. You need to be a part of it, but you also need to understand that we are not doomed. We have ways that we can fix these things, and if they walk away thinking they're doomed, they won't be any help. And so that's sort of what we need to work on blame. Jim, to your point, the sort of disarmament issue. I think I don't know. I don't know what the end of poverty looks like. I don't know what the end of hunger looks like or full gender equality. Doesn't mean I don't think those are directions that we should be driving in. And I think that's sort of why 0 is sort of put out as an end goal, not only because it's in the MPT, but because there's a place we're trying to go, and it's a place that is hopefully less dangerous than this. But I don't necessarily have to know what that endpoint is. On the blame thing, I'm serious about the Spider-Man thing. Like the MPT RevCon is literally just going to be the US and Russia and China pointing at each other. And everybody trying to figure it out. I think about Animal Farm. And there's a line in there that everyone is equal. Some are just more equal than others. And I think like everyone is responsible for the current state of nuclear threats. Some are just more responsible than others. And I think, acknowledging that some people might not actually, acquiesce to the idea that they've caused the problems. The US has usually been the leader despite the pain that is. And I've had people along the way be like, why is it fair that the US is always having to go and be the bigger, country and try to clean up the messes and lead on things? And then, the Russians never come up with any solutions. It's only the US. And my response to that is always like, we can choose to be like the Russians and the Chinese. That's always been an option available to us. We've just seen in the past that there are consequences to that, and we've chosen otherwise. We're kind of now choosing it, and now we're seeing the consequences of being more like Russia and China on these things. And I think, the blame is there to go around. My position as a diplomat is like, yeah, I don't care. I just want to fix these problems. And so to me, that means just sucking it up and letting people get away without taking their share of the blame. If they're going to actually make deals with us that are in our national security interests, fine.
Okay, last 2 questions, and like Taylor, I'm sort of on the razor thin edge of time management. We'll do Joanne and Casper, and then quick questions, quick response.
Yeah.
And then we will thank Alex for a phenomenal talk. So, Joanne?
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned about the nuclear weapon-free zone earlier in your talk. So ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have for the longest time been encouraging the US to sign the protocol to the Schonfest Treaty. but US has a lot of reservations about it. Can you explain what are the US reservations? This is Southeast Asia, this is not East Asia. And also, by the way, China wants to sign the protocol to the treaty without any reservation. So could you explain that? Thank you.
Put nukes in the Philippines. Okay. Yeah, okay. Casper.
How would you respond to believers in nuclear revolution that would argue proliferation might actually be good for international stability, not necessarily from a US policy perspective, but from the perspective of stability of the international system? And should the US withdraw for whatever reason its nuclear extended deterrent over its allies in East Asia and Europe? Should those allies be allowed to proliferate? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing from your perspective?
Oh, just a short.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you said allowed. Also in my hometown at the one bar, somebody once came at me and they're like, who are we to tell Iran what to do in terms of nuclear weapons? And I was like, we are not anybody. Iran agreed that they will not get nuclear weapons. And that, that legal framework is the basis for our pressure. The countries that have signed up to the NPT, including those allies you spoke of, they're allowed to do whatever they want. They would have to break their commitment to the NPT. And I think there's a long conversation to be had about whether or not their security is better served. Most countries in this world think their security is better served without nuclear weapons. And that concept is beginning to fray. But I think, any country thinking about going down that road has to think about what is the full scope of the consequences of this choice. And I think from a doesn't make more stability, I think I could just come at it from the idea that once you go down this road, there's really not a good way to stop it. And there are a lot of countries that I think people would be like, yeah, like, not them. They're okay, not them. And, things change. In the process of doing the NPR, 2 countries that we were consulting with took the exact opposite positions after they had an election during the engagement process, like literally flipped 100%. Countries can be volatile. And the idea that one day, a government is in place, 3 out of the 4 last presidents of South Korea are in jail. Like, there are things to consider other than just the security parameters about whether or not this is a long-term good choice. So I think, but more discussion is necessary, including what happens when countries providing extended deterrence guarantees start waffling on those inexplicably, because I still haven't heard a good reason why we wouldn't want to have a forward projection of American power and also PS prevent proliferation. It's just sort of manifesting without a lot of good policy idea behind it, and that's a problem. On ASEAN, I am of the mind that the U.S. would sign the protocol today, and P.S. China does have reservations, and I think that's actually been sort of borne out. I think the Philippines in particular have pointed out reservations. The U.S. would sign Sean Fiz's protocol just like it signed all the other ones, understanding that the U.S. has a conception of a negative security assurance that is simply how we think about negative security assurances. And if Sean Fiz is okay with that, we can sign it today. I think the U.S. is supportive of free zones in general, and I think it's supportive of that one in particular. But the U.S. is not going to change its way of thinking about negative security assurances. So, if ASEAN wants it, they can have it. They're just going to have it the way that every other free zone has it.
Well, it was a sign of a great talk. We had, I think, 14 participants. Thank you all for coming and for participating so vigorously. And Alex, thank you for coming up from DC for just a wonderful talk. And please join me in thanking Alex.